What's up, everybody? Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris Baker. I am husband to Tanya Baker, who works in the children's ministry. And no, I did not just recently break out of prison. I scrubbed and scrubbed and scrubbed my arms, and this just wouldn't come off. So here I am. So we're in the series talking about meeting the real God. And you might be thinking, okay, what does that mean? Like, what are we talking about meeting God? I meet God on Sundays and during midweek programming and in my prayer time in the morning around breakfast. And I've known about him since I was like 4 and learned about the old guy in the boat and the animals and the rain and all that stuff. But we're talking about something a little different. That's kind of when we decide that we're going to come and meet God. We're talking a little bit more about when he decides that he's going to come and encounter and meet us. And so there's 2 different stories here that I want to share that I want you to see if you can kind of pick the difference. So someone might come up to you and say, oh yeah, I've met Peyton Manning. I went to training camp and he signed my jersey and it was awesome. Okay, so that's story 1. Story 2 is I was sitting in my house watching TV. I didn't even have a shirt on, and Peyton Manning kicked in my door and was like, hey, how are you doing? I'm Peyton Manning. I'm going to be in your backyard for the next couple weeks teaching a passing class, and I might be crashing here, so just a heads up, I'm going to be here for a few weeks. He went over, opened my fridge, went through my stuff, got some food and some chips, came over and laid down on my couch. 2 different stories. That feels a little different, right? So that's kind of what we're talking about, is the difference between, oh yeah, I've met God, and oh, you know what? God had an encounter, and he met me. I met the real God, and what that was like. So we're going to be talking about Moses used by God, and so we're going to be reading today from Exodus 3. If you have your Bibles, feel free to open them up. If not, you can follow along on the screen. We're going to start Exodus 3, 1 through 6. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There an angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Don't come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. So the first thing that we have to address is that I'm thankful that this didn't happen in today's times, because if it did, Moses might have missed it fumbling around for his phone trying to take a selfie with the bush or trying to live stream it to his Facebook page, right? The Israelites would still be stuck in Egypt and we have a much different story. So thank God that this did not happen recently and this was in the old times. But what we want to look at is that Moses went not because the bush was on fire specifically. He went because the fire wasn't consuming the bush. That's why he went over there to check it out. It wasn't enough that there was a fire in the middle of the desert. It's that it had to be somewhat of a phenomenon that this bush wasn't being consumed, and that's what got his attention. And I kind of liken this to when you might be at home and your spouse gets back from a day of shopping and they're telling you some things, but you might be distracted. Either you're on a phone or you got the game on or something like that. And so they realize this and they start telling you about their day. They say, yeah, so I was out, I got some coffee, bought some shoes, your best friend was arrested for arson, and you're like, wait, what? That catches your attention, right? And so that's kind of what I'm talking about. And just a heads up, that's something I've heard from my friends and their wives. I've never experienced it myself. But that's what we need sometimes, and that's what Moses needed, was a little bit of that, something different, something out of the norm to catch his attention. Sometimes we need that magical fire to snap us out of our daily routine. And I think that how many of us are walking around with blinders on, missing the fires that are going on around us and needing something super special or super phenomenal to catch our attention. And this is going to lead us to our first point. So if you have your bulletin and you are filling in the blanks, this is the section you want to pay attention to. It's that meeting the real God can happen anywhere. So how many times had Moses been by this place before? He had been shepherding in the area for 40 years. So I'm wondering, I don't know. I'm asking just in saying, I don't know if he walked by this place once a week or a few times a day, or if this was just on his normal path or routine. But How many times had he been there? And what makes a desert filled with sand and covered in sheep feces a holy place? I think as a culture and a church that we tend to compartmentalize and say that God happens on Sunday in service, and it happens during my midweek times or the times when I decide that I'm going to pray. But I can tell you that there's plenty of times that my 1994 Camry has been a holy place, right? Whether I'm driving to work and God is moving through music and I have those moments where I encounter God. Sometimes it happens in my dinky gold car where the paint's peeling on the hood. But with that in mind, if it can happen in my 94 Camry, it's possible that your home is holy ground. It's possible that your office is holy ground. And it's also possible that the filthy alley in Denver that's covered in used needles and urine can be a holy place if God deems it so. Parents, grandparents, people that deal with young kids, this is something that you can use when they're outside and it's pouring rain and they're playing and they get filthy muddy. You can say, oh, hold on, before you come in, take off your shoes. This could be holy ground. So you can feel free to use that. And if they question, you just say, God said. But we've seen other times where this happens through this series, through what Paul's been leading us through. And we see that God appeared to Abraham near some trees at the entrance of his tent. God met Jacob on the side of a river when he was trying to flee from Esau. And God met Hagar near a spring in the desert. Now, the other thing that we have to remember, though, is this series we're really focused on Old Testament, right? But this also happens, there's New Testament examples. So we look at the story of the woman at the well, where God met her is actually in the title of the story. The well is a place that she was going to draw water. And again, just like the mountainside, who knows how many times she had been there? Was it the first time that day? Did she go there 30 times a day? I don't know. But this was just a common place for her to go to draw water when she had that real life-changing encounter with Jesus. Lazarus was in his own tomb. Okay, so that's kind of a different situation, I guess, right there. Lazarus was in his tomb. Saul was on the road on the way to persecute Christians. So we can't limit our thinking and limit the possibilities of encountering God to just church and church buildings or the times that are designated God times. We see examples through with Jesus that so many times when he was encountering people and meeting people, it was on the way somewhere, it was taking a trip or a journey somewhere, and it was out in these real places. And there's a few times that we hear about Jesus in like a holy place or the temple, and one of those times he was frustrated and throwing tables and making a scene because the church wasn't what it was supposed to be. So what we have to do is we have to open ourselves up to meeting the real God and knowing that it can happen and take place literally anywhere. Now, moving along to point 2, which goes along with the same set of scripture here, is that meeting the real God can happen anytime. So what I want to do is take a little moment and discuss Moses leading up to this. If you're not familiar with Moses, his mother feared for his life when he was born. She sent him on a raft down a river, which I think is kind of weird if you think about it, right? Like, she's fearful for his safety. She sends a baby in a raft on the river, like, woo, good luck, which is kind of crazy, but that's how the story goes, and that's what happened. And Pharaoh's daughter is down there in the river and sees Moses, brings him out and raises Moses in Egypt. Now, a little kind of interesting side fact is that Moses means drawn out, which I think is really cool. And I'm assuming it means because he was drawn out of the river, but I'm also finding a lot of relation in the fact that maybe it's because he was drawn out of hiding, which we're going to get to here in just a little bit. Or maybe it's the fact that he drew out the Israelites from Egypt. But either way, I think just a little side note that Moses meaning drawn out is super fitting and also kind of interesting and cool. But so here is Moses living in Egypt. He's living the good life, right? And he's eating the best foods, probably getting great education, doing whatever Egyptians were doing at that time, which I'm assuming was pretty awesome. But he also had this moment where he realized he knew he wasn't Egyptian. So he started feeling a draw to his kinfolk. And because of that, when he saw an Egyptian beating up a Hebrew, he snapped and he killed the Egyptian. Hid the body, thought, okay, wipe my hands of that, I'm clean, I'm moving on to the next thing. Until he was confronted about that. And someone said, hey, Moses, I know what you did. I saw you kill that guy. And he freaked out and left, and he fled to Midian, which is basically northwest Saudi Arabia, which I don't know about you, but I can think of about 50 places that I would flee to before I would go to northwest Saudi Arabia. Seemed to work for him, and that's okay, I guess. There he meets Jethro, he marries, and he shepherds for 40 years. And so we've got a graphic that I'm going to put up so that we can look at this. I'm a visual learner, and I have to tell you, you guys should feel pretty cool because this is not just me Google searching an image, and I hand drew this with rulers and pens, and so you guys are getting the best of the best here. But if you are a visual learner like me, then this might help, is that you can see that he was born for 40 years, living the good life, kills the Egyptian, flees to Midian. We've got another 40 years that I call quiet hiding, going up to the burning bush, which is what we're talking about now. We see another 40-year span, which I say wandering. Now, there's a lot that happened there. Obviously, there's 10 Commandments, there's a parting of the Red Sea, a lot of big stuff, but I kind of summed it up as wandering because he's wandering around waiting for the promised land. And then at 120 years, here lies Mo, his death. So if you're a visual learner and you want to look at this and piece it apart, you can look and see in that lifespan of 120 years, 2/3 of Moses' life had gone by before he encountered and met the real God. So we all come from different walks of life and we bring different experiences to the table. And so you might think an encounter with God is a negative thing. Maybe you've had something in your past that makes it feel like that's a negative experience. Or maybe you're sitting there 2/3 of the way through your life thinking, I'm desperately waiting for my encounter with God, to meet the real God, and you're feeling frustrated. And my advice would be don't give up. Don't give up. 2/3 of his life. Moses was 80 years old when he had this first big, real, raw encounter with God. Lazarus was dead. So if you're thinking it's too late for you, think again. And not just dead. I think he was dead for like a couple days, right? I think he said he stunk. Like, for stink to kick in, that's bad. So don't give up. But I also want to touch on the fact that I think it's interesting in the scriptures here that it says Moses hid his face and was afraid to look at God. Now, I'm sure that was due to God's ultimate holiness, but I'm also wondering, is it possible that Moses was also living with guilt and afraid that God might be confronting him on a cold case file that just got reopened? 40 years tending sheep gives you a lot of time to think about the mistakes that you've made, about the decisions that have led you up to where you're at. And so I'm sure that he's sitting there thinking about that. I know in the times that I'm hunting or camping and I've got that quiet time, man, it's a perfect time to just sit and think. And shepherds at the time had a very quiet life. So to sit there and think about what he's done, I wonder if he was a little freaked out thinking, here God is, to be like, hey, remember 40 years ago when you killed a guy? Yeah, I'm God, and we're going to talk about that. Probably a little bit of stress. And this might be reminiscent of the times when maybe you were in school or you were at home and you got in trouble and you're waiting. Someone says, wait until your father gets home. And so you're spending that whole time thinking, oh gosh, what did I do that led up to this? Why am I now waiting for my dad to get home? Or you're at school and they're saying, hey, your parents are coming to talk to you about why you got suspended. And they're giving you this information and you're sitting there stewing on it thinking the whole time. And it's miserable because you've had this time just to sit and think about what you've done. This is also not from firsthand experience. I had friends tell me about this. And right now you guys are saying, we know you don't have friends, so that's a lie. But how many of us have been tending our flock in the desert, avoiding eye contact with God, just with these blinders, thinking, I'm not looking for those times because we're afraid or we're feeling guilt or shame about our past or the things that we've done. We're dwelling on the things that we've done that have led us up to this spot in our life where we're at. Or we might think, you know what? God, why don't you give me a little bit of time? Let me get my life together. Let me get some things together. Let me become the best Christian or the best husband or the best man or the best woman that I can be. And then we can have our encounter. Let me get my life together. But there's a news flash here is that it's not on our time. And that's the important thing to remember is that it's not going to be on our time. We can't say, let me get my stuff together and then we can chat, God. And also, if Moses needed a burning bush that wasn't consuming the bush itself to snap him out from his quiet shepherding ways, imagine what we might need in a world filled with cell phones and social media updates and emails and dance recitals and sports schedules and games and things that we're doing and meetings with friends and coffee and all that. I think for us, we got to stop, slow down a little bit, and be open and waiting for God to give us that moment where he says, hey, it's time. I'm having this encounter. So let's go ahead and continue reading Exodus 3, 7 through 10. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and now the cry of the Israelites has reached me. And I feel like we need to add in more ites, like Pedialites and LED lights. And there's a lot of ites in there, so it gets a little tongue-twisting. And I've seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And first off, a little side note from this message that I want to address right now is that if you are in distress, if you are hurting, if you are dealing with depression or anxiety or financial issues or marital problems and you're crying out to God, I want to right now clear the air and say that God hears you. And we know that. You may not seem like it at times. Remember when I said it's not on our time? That's something that we need to remember, is that we're crying out, God hears us, although it may not seem like it at times, He does. And so I just want to be very clear on that before we move on. It has nothing to do with this message, just something I wanted to address. Now going back into the message, you can guys get back into message mode. Point number 3 on your bulletin. God may lead you to places you would rather avoid. Now, I've seen enough Scooby-Doo and Murder, She Wrote to know that you don't return to the scene of the crime, right? Moses spent 40 years hiding from Pharaoh in Egypt. Again, he's thinking, I don't know what he's thinking. I don't know what's going through his head, but he might be thinking, hey, I don't know if the last Pharaoh is still in charge, or maybe it's a new Pharaoh. I don't know if there is a new Pharaoh. Maybe he told the new Pharaoh about Moses and said, hey, if this guy comes back, here's his picture. This is what he looks like. You get him. But Moses spent 40 years hiding from this, and here God is saying, hey, I need you to go back to that place that you ran from. And we see other examples of this throughout this series. In Genesis 16, we see God telling Hagar to return to Sarah, the exact person that she was fleeing from. And this is kind of just a natural thing in God's nature, is that He sends us to these places that we would rather avoid. In the New Testament, even Jesus, knowing what is coming, in Matthew 26, He prays and says, God, if there's any other way, let it be. And we know how that ended, and it's not the case because God is pushing us to the places that we would rather avoid. So with that in mind, if the street in front of your house is a holy place, then maybe God is sending you to the neighbor who you've been bickering with or you've had bad blood with and trying to connect and saying, look, I know you bickered in the past, but it's time to go across the street and deal with that. Maybe your backyard is deemed a holy place by God, and so you encounter Him and you meet Him while you're watering the plants. And God is saying, hey, you know that person at work that's kind of weird that nobody gets along with and they're kind of strange? I need you to go to them and I need you to connect with them. And if you're sitting there racking your brain and you're thinking, I can't think of anyone weird at work like that, then maybe you're the weird one and be prepared for someone to be meeting God and coming to talk to you. But on a serious note, maybe it's your spouse. And maybe you've been spending 40 years, so to speak, fleeing and hiding because you're dealing with marital problems. And He's saying, look, go to your spouse. Repair the relationship. Take care of it. And you're thinking, no. We're not on speaking terms. We're dealing with issues right now. And He's saying, I know. It's not the place that you want to go, but you need to go and you need to take care of that. I think that modern missionaries are kind of a great example of this too. So I'm thinking about it. Do you think that there's a ton of people out there that are like, what would be just awesome if I could sell everything I have and leave everything I've ever known to go to a place I've never been and hang out with people I don't know and risk execution and disease? This sounds like a vacation. No, I know that they're going because they're called by God, but I don't think that's everyone's first time agenda item that they're like, this would be perfect. And I know if I had my choice, I would go to a place that was probably about 70 degrees all the time. It was friendly. The people there were great. There was free coffee, and nobody needed to hear about Jesus. And it sounds selfish, but I can be a selfish person, and that's easy. And that's what I would want, is that easy thing, to go and just be like, yeah, I'm just going to sit and drink coffee and hang out. But what would this story look like if God said, Moses, I need you to go, get on a boat, and go to Hawaii and sit on the beach, and there Cabana Boy will bring you drinks and appetizers until the end of time? First off, you would say, there's a Cabana Boy in the Bible? That's weird. I don't know if I remember that. But secondly, you would think that's not really fitting with God's design and what he has in store and what his agenda is. So God pushes us out of our comfort zone. We're going to continue reading Exodus 3. We're 11 through 15 now. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, all right, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you're to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and the name you shall call me from generation to generation. So this is going to segue us into our fourth and final point, which don't get too excited. We still have plenty to cover after this, but this is our fourth and final point in the bulletin, is that he will be with you and he will equip you. So imagine showing up to an Olympic swim meet. You used to be a competitor. You show up to an Olympic swim meet and you're in your early 70s. You put on 40, 50, 80 pounds. You're out of shape, you're tired, you're not in swimming condition. And you get there and all the racers are laughing at you and saying, what are you doing here? Who sent you? And you say, Michael Phelps sent me. You carry a little bit of clout with that, right? So you take that, you multiply it by 23 kajillion, and now you've got a sense of the power that Moses had when he was going in there. And kajillion is a real word. Don't look it up, just trust me. But it might be scary going to the places that you would rather avoid. But he tells Moses there, and what he tells us is that I will be with you. I also like the I am section. The I am section there, where he says, I am who I am, kind of reminds me of like the mob boss scene in a movie, right? Where he's just super powerful and like, hey, no, leave the windows down. Feel free to leave your wallet in the car. Everyone knows who that car belongs to. They're not going to touch it. Like, that's the sense that I get when God is like, I am who I am. He's just saying, like, look, I'm powerful. Just leave it be. But what's one of the things that keeps us from going where God wants us to go, from pursuing the things that God wants us to pursue? It's fear. But God is with us, right? He gives strength to the weak. And with God on our side, we should feel untouchable. And I'm reminded of a quote from A.W. Tozer, who is someone I've shared quotes from before. And I want to share just a little bit about him. He was born in April 1897, died May 1963. He was considered a modern-day prophet. He gave his life to Christ at 17. He authored many books, and he had this is the part I want to stress, he had no formal theological training. And at 22, he started pastoring a church in the 20s in Chicago. Now, I wasn't around in the 20s in Chicago, but I can tell you I've done a little bit of research and understanding what was going on at that time. And if you're familiar with Chicago in the 20s, you might think of things like Al Capone. You might think of things like Prohibition. You might think of the late 20s, the stock market crash. So if there's somebody who knows a little bit about trusting God to equip him, I would think that it's somebody who had no formal theological training and decided he was going to pastor a church in Chicago in the 20s, going up against what seems like unbeatable odds. So let's go ahead and bring up the picture here so you can get a picture of what he looks like and take a look at his quote. He says, God knows us better than we know ourselves, and he knows exactly what we need and when we need it. Again, if there's anybody that I could trust to know that God will equip you, it's a man like this who dealt with the things that he dealt with and still pushed past. And again, considered like a modern day prophet. So you might have heard it as God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called. And if he knows us better than we know ourselves, then he's already got answers for all of our excuses. Now what I want to do, we're going to jump ahead. We're going to be reading into Exodus 4. We're going to go through 1 through 17. And we're going to touch now on what makes Moses probably my favorite person in the Bible. So go ahead and turn to Exodus 4, 1 through 17. It says, Moses answered, "What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, 'The Lord did not appear to you'?" Then the Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" "A staff," he replied. The Lord said, "Throw it on the ground." Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it. Which I can think. Can you imagine a man in his 80s throwing down a wooden staff and becoming a snake and seeing him bolt? I'm willing to bet that God was up there being like, "Hey, this is going to be awesome. Watch this." Throw it down and watch him. So the Lord said to him, "Reach out your hand and take it by the tail." So Moses reached out and took hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff in his hand. "This," said the Lord, "is so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you." And then the Lord said, "Put your hand inside your cloak." So Moses put his hand in the cloak. When he took it out, the skin was leprous, and it became white as snow. "Now put it back into your cloak," he said. So Moses put his hand back in, and when he took it out, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. Then the Lord said, "If they do not believe you or pay attention to the first sign, they may believe the second. But if they don't believe these two signs or listen to you, take some water from the Nile and pour it out on the dry ground. And the water you take from the Nile will become blood on the ground." Moses said to the Lord, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." If that's the case, I'm willing to bet that it didn't go as smoothly when he was sitting there fearful, trying to defend himself there. And the Lord said to him, "Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will help you speak and will teach you what to say." But Moses said, "Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send somebody else." Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, which is not a good place to be. And he said, "What about your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and he will be glad to see you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth, and I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth, and as if you were God to him. But take this staff in the hand, and so you can perform the signs with it." This is a part of Moses' story that I feel like is most relatable to me, and probably a lot of you, I'm willing to bet. In my head, what I want to happen here is when he says, "Now go, I'm sending you to Egypt," I want Moses to rip the sleeves off of his tunic. I want him to take his hand and put it in some ash and give himself some war paint and get on a horse and ride in strength and power. And that's what I picture for myself in my spiritual life. When I think about God meeting me and saying, "Look, this is where I'm sending you," in my head, I'm like, "Yep, I'm going to be there, and I'm going to be ripping off the sleeves on my tunic, and we're going to go full force." But that's really rarely the case. And so that's, again, maybe it's because I grew up in like the Schwarzenegger era or something. I don't know. But that's what I picture in my head, is this like warrior mode. But through this whole interaction, Moses is encountering the real God, and he still comes back with reasons why he can't. God is literally making miracles happen before him, and he's still coming back with reasons why he shouldn't be the one to go. I feel like this is, again, my life. Story of my life is that oftentimes God, when I say often, let me rephrase, always, God is taking care of me. Through good times and bad, he is always there. And no matter what, I constantly doubt him later in the future for things. For 33 years, God has had my back and taken care of me. And I'm like, yeah. For 33 years, God has got me, but what about next year? And I doubt the things that he's done. And so this is why Moses is most relatable to me. And Moses said, "I have never been good at speaking." And just like a good dad, God suggests he go with his brother. But this isn't like when a dad says to his unathletic son, "Hey, Why don't you bring your brother Aaron, who's really muscular and well-built, to move that couch? He's not suggesting it in that way. What he's doing is God knows that Moses can do this with God's strength. But he also senses that Moses has a little bit of fear and hesitation, and so he gives him basically the equivalent of a security blanket. So what's awesome is that this past week, I had a situation with my youngest son, Chase, who will be 4 in October, and it works out perfectly because it fits into the message. But we're hanging out downstairs, and he's brought all of his big block Legos downstairs into the living room. And he's also brought his backpack down. He's been building and playing and having a good time. And finally, it comes time to clean it up. And I say, hey, I need you to, before we do anything else, I need you to pick up all your Legos and bring them upstairs. And of course, it's like, oh, this is terrible. I can't do it. So I get on him again. I say, no, you just need to pick all of them up. I know you can do it. Just pick up your Legos and go upstairs. And he's like, oh, this is miserable. And he's picking up one and then like, oh, walking up. And at this rate, I'm like, we're not getting done anytime soon. So I'm telling him, saying, look, I know you can do it. Why don't you put them in your backpack? You could put all those Legos in your backpack and walk it upstairs to your room. And he's still like just casually bringing them over and putting them in. So finally, I say, okay, Chase, what if I hold open the backpack and you can put the Legos in? And he was on board. So I am holding the backpack down. I'm sitting on the couch. I'm not even getting up. Sitting on the couch while he loads Legos in. And after about the third or fourth piece, I just let go, right? Pull my hands away. And it's sitting there open, and he's loading them up the way that I had initially said. I know I'm a genius. But that's kind of what I like in this too, is that I knew full well that Chase could have taken those Legos and put them in the backpack himself. But I also knew I was tired of fighting him on it and felt like, you know what? Okay, I'm going to hold the backpack. I'm going to send your brother Aaron, the Levite, who can talk for you. And we'll get this done. So God may be pushing you on your own to a place that you don't want to go, while assuring you all the while that he's got your back and that his strength will be enough for you. But he also might sense and know that you've got some fear and some hesitation. And if that's the case, he's got your back and he's got a plan and he will equip you the way that you need. So, we encounter God. Who cares? What's it all for? What it's for is so that we can further his kingdom, so that we can serve out his purpose and his will and do the things that he's called us to. We should care because it's what our Father wants, and it should be what we want. We should align our hearts with his. And so we find so often in these biblical accounts that when God has these real encounters and meets people in a real way, it's so that they can carry out his desires and serve out his purposes. And so the title of this message today is Moses, Used by God. And I think that so often in our culture, the word used has a real negative stigma around it, right? You say, oh, yeah, I got overworked. The boss used me because they knew I wouldn't say no. Or my previous relationship, I was used and abused. But in this sense, used by God is a badge of honor. So when we encounter the real God and we have that time where we meet the real God, it's not going to be so that we can get a nicer car or a bigger house or better clothes or a full head of hair. It's so that we can fulfill his desires, so that we can further his kingdom here, but also the kingdom to come. And so with that, we'll go ahead and invite the worship team up and we'll pray. Heavenly Father, Lord, we come before you this morning, and first off, I want to say thank you for Moses. Thank you for somebody that is relatable. Thank you for somebody that we can see that did your work, but also had some rebuttals, and like us, maybe was a little hesitant and a little scared. And God, we thank you for the chance to come together and to worship you and to be together. And Lord, I ask that you would open our eyes and our hearts and our minds to the burning bushes that you have around us, Lord. Help us to lift our blinders. Help us to slow down. Help us to put things aside so that we can be open to the times that you have set aside to meet with us, Lord. And Lord, I pray for everyone here today. I pray that we would not just meet you and get our jersey signed, but we would let you bust in our door, live on our couch, and do the things that you need to do through us. We praise you and honor your Son's name, Jesus. Amen.